I am here to talk to you about rebel talent. And I would like to start by asking you to think about the type of words that come to mind when you think about the rebels in your organizations. Now, this is a question that I love to often ask whenever I talk to people like you or whenever I'm spending time in organizations. And it's interesting to see the type of words that usually come to mind. So there are the outcasts, the troublemakers. Sometimes I hear words like criminals. Can you please show them the door? They are annoying. They should be punished. Now, what I want to do in the time that we have together is try to give you a new perspective on who the rebels are in organizations, at least in the way I think about them, as I think about them agents of positive change, people who can really bring about a lot of innovation, but doing something a little bit differently. Now, at their very core, rebels are people who allow us to think differently about something that seems to be a widespread problem in a lot of organizations. I think I'm preaching to people who know what I'm talking about, and it's the fact that if you look across the globe, across industries, across organizations, we seem to be having a crisis, an engagement crisis. And in fact, I want to remind you of some data that you might have seen from 2016 that shows that most people who are at work are kind of not there. That if you look at the percentage of people who are engaged at work across organizations globally, it's quite low. These are people who are psychologically committed to the work that the organization is doing. They find energy in the work that they do. But as for the other people, they're not that really committed to what the organization is trying to do. And in fact, some of them are actively working against what the organization is trying to do. In fact, these are the people who are physically present, but psychologically, they're somewhere else. Now, this is a problem because if you look at the data, and there is quite a bit of it, the evidence suggests that when we are engaged in our jobs, all sorts of good things happen. We tend to be much more creative. Our ideas are much more innovative. When it's time to really push ahead and put effort in our jobs, we're willing to work really hard. So both at the company level as well as at the employee level, we see that engagement brings about all sorts of benefits. So the question is, why is it that we seem to be missing out on those benefits? And I want to suggest that it's because of our very human nature. All of us, on a daily basis, tend to behave like this. And I want to give you a sense of how exactly this occurs with a little bit of a video. Have a look at what's happening here. You see this guy doing something that we regularly do when we get into the elevator. And all of a sudden, some other people are joining in. And they behave a little bit differently. And he feels uncomfortable, so much so that even if we know it's wrong, we just turn around. And we follow their lead. Now, this is powerful because it captures something that is very true to our human nature. You can look around, and often we don't follow our own behavior, we follow the behavior of others. There are lots of interesting studies in psychology and management showing that often we fall prey to conformity pressures. Even when we know that the decision we are saying yes to or the behavior that we're engaging in is actually wrong and not that helpful to the organization. We also fall prey to another bias, which is taking the status quo, taking routines, processes, tradition in our organizations for granted, and we sort of stop asking ourselves, why is it that those procedures are actually there? So given that this is part of the problem, how is it that these rebels do things differently? How is it that they fix it? And this is something that I thought a lot about. And in studying many different rebels who I thought were really successful in what they were doing, I discovered that there is a really interesting connection in trying to understand engagement from contexts where that comes very naturally to us. Think about a time you are reading a novel and you just can't put the book down. Or maybe you're watching a movie and you're glued to your seat, so much so that you're ready to watch it again as soon as it finishes. There is something about this context where storytelling is keeping us engaged. So what I want to do with you today is propose some ideas directly from the way storytellers think about their stories in a way that engage people. And I want to suggest that the same ideas can be brought back to work. So in thinking about storytelling, one company that I had the chance to study, since I think they're pretty great at storytelling, is Pixar. So you'll see that some of the examples that I'm going to use come from this very context. But as I said, I'm going to bring in some research and some insights from other organizations as well. I want to suggest 3 ideas that are at the core of why we stay engaged in stories that we find compelling. And the 3 ideas are emotional connection, the presence of tension and conflict, and also unpredictability. And I'm going to tell you that these are ideas that don't come naturally to us. In fact, the rebel against all the tendencies that bring us to do just the opposite of these 3 ideas. So let's start with emotional connection. The person you see here is Pete Docter, is one of the directors working at Pixar Animation Studio, and is the person who directed Monsters, Inc. And when I was visiting Pixar, he told me a really interesting story about how the movie came about, but also some of the struggles that he and his team met as they were developing the story. As Pixar works on movies, as you can imagine, there are lots of screening internally where people get feedback from others in terms of whether the story is engaging or not. And in the first screening, Docter was pretty confident that the story was going to be engaging. There are monsters who scare children. What could be more engaging than that? And yet, he put the movie out there in the screening, and about 10-15 minutes into the movie, people started looking at their watch, not really being interested in the story as it was developing. And so he went back to the drawing board, rethinking the stories and the elements that he could bring in order for the story to be more engaging. And the idea that he worked with was the one of emotional connection. Now, this was a time in his life where Docter had his first child, Nick, and that made him look at work differently. Probably many of you had had this experience. You're sort of a workaholic, work is all you do, and now there are little ones in your life and they need attention. And they're kind of cute, so you do like spending time with them, but they take a lot of care. And so Docter thought of Sully, this giant furry monster, as somebody who needed such a connection, the same that he was experiencing in his life. And so all of a sudden, a new character was brought into the story, which is a little girl called Boo. And if you remember the movie, if you watched it, basically she spent her time getting into trouble, exactly like my children, and then you're there trying to help her out and save her. And that creates an emotional connection between those 2 characters. Now, you might be thinking, what does that have to do with what we see in organizations? Well, as it turns out, we're much more engaged in our jobs when we feel that type of emotional connection with work and with the other people around us in organizations. How do we get there? I'm going to suggest that emotional connection comes to us whenever we are willing to rebel against the comfortable feeling of covering up at work. When we are willing to make ourselves vulnerable, show we are at work, we're better able to create strong connection and much deeper connection, not only with our work, but also with others. I want to give you an example of how this can come about. I'm going to go to 2003. This is a big night for Coach Maurice Cheeks. He has a big game that is going to see his team play. And at the beginning of the game, something really interesting happens where he sees an opportunity to make himself vulnerable. So we're going to watch a video of what was happening exactly that night.
And now to honor America and salute the men and women serving our country with our national anthem, please welcome, as voted by you, the fans, our winner of the Toyota Get the Feeling of a Star promotion, Natalie Gilbert.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the stars like stars. Stars like last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. Oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red and sea and air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Now, let's state the obvious. He doesn't have a great voice. He's off-tuned the entire song. But what is interesting is that he shows us something that often we don't do at work that could be actually quite beneficial in creating that emotional connection and that engagement, and is the willingness to fight our fears and make ourselves vulnerable, to be authentic, and to show ourselves as we are at work. Now, what is interesting is that in doing so, we really create different connections with other people. If your heart didn't move a little bit stronger or faster as you were watching this movie clip, I think you have a problem. When we see ourselves putting out there, showing others who we are, those connections come much more easily. And yet, here we see him doing so in front of 20,000 people. When we get to work, we have 20,000 factors working against us that tell us that we should really leave a good chunk of ourselves at the door. Now, how is it that this could be different? It could be different right from the start. I'm going to give you an example of Melody Opson. She's currently the president of Ariel Investment, a money management firm based in Chicago. And what is interesting about her is that she started working at Ariel right after college, when she was 22. And the first day on the job, she had a meeting with the CEO, who told her the following. He told her that she would be spending time in meetings with a lot of people, with a lot of money, who likely felt entitled and powerful. And yet, he really wanted her to express her views, to hear her voice. So in a sense, right from the start, the CEO was giving her license to be authentic and to be who she is. Not a lot of organizations do that, and yet, when this is the approach, as you welcome people to the organizations, the benefits can be quite amazing. I'll tell you about a study that I conducted with an organization in India. Their name is Wipro Technologies. They have a side of the business in business process outsourcing. And if you've ever thought about those jobs or know something about them, it's not easy. We talk to a lot of employees working there. It feels as if you're stripped away of your identity because you're on calls, working hours, often with Americans who are not that happy to be talking to you. And what we decided to do is, right from the start, on the first day when they're welcome to the organization, we gave them the chance to reflect on their strengths, on who they are, what's unique about them, and how is it that they could sculpt their jobs a little bit differently, such that they could be themselves more often at work. We were interested in how this type of intervention would go, so we actually ran a real field study with the organization. So imagine some employees coming in and basically going through one of two different processes. One, that was the process that we designed for them, where we added this extra half hour of reflection. And for the others, the things were as usual. And what is interesting is that when we started working with the organization, they were particularly worried about the fact that after spending money on people to train them, they would leave about 45 to 60 days into the job. And so they were particularly interested in their turnover rates. We were able to fix that. We were able to lower their turnover rate significantly just by giving people the opportunity to think about who they are and bring out the strengths in their jobs. We also saw that their performance was better, and we also saw that their engagement at work was better. Now, this is not the only context where authenticity matters. Authenticity also matters in many other contexts where performance is a variable of interest. We study entrepreneurs giving pitches for their ideas to venture capitalists and receiving money and funding to start their businesses. And what we found is that when the entrepreneurs are being authentic in their pitches, when they make themselves vulnerable and recognize possible flaws, they're much more likely to receive money to support their business ideas. Now, one other thing that authenticity does, and vulnerability does for us, is to help us face tough challenges. I want to bring you to Italy with me, which I would say is quite a good country to visit. And in particular, I would like you to go to Modena. This is Chef Massimo Bottura. He's a chef whose restaurant in 2016 won the award for being the best restaurant in the world. And if you look at his story, it's quite an interesting one. He looked at something that you really shouldn't be touching, Italian cooking. We have all sorts of rules, all sorts of traditions. Nobody messes up with those fantastic recipes that have been cemented by centuries of work. And yet he did. And he tried to look at traditions, question them, and think about whether they, at a good place, whether they were making sense at all, and whether a change was needed. And when he opened his restaurant in 1995, he met a lot of resistance. He described resistance from this very traditional Italian, very proud Italian, who really didn't want to taste his food and just spend time criticizing him. And it was tough for him, but in the summer of 2000, he went and spent time at Il Bulli, who at the time was also a 3 Michelin star restaurant. And what he learned from the chef and owner of Il Bulli is to look inside and express his own fire. And so when he went back to Modena, he really thought about how he could best express himself with his own cooking, not being too afraid of fighting the resistance. And soon afterwards, he received the first Michelin star, and a couple of years later, 2 other stars arrived at the restaurant, making it a 3 Michelin star restaurant. Now, what Bottura experienced by being himself is something much more general. My colleagues and I have done quite a bit of work trying to understand whether authenticity is really what keeps us going when it comes to facing challenges, and we found that that is the case. Now, I live in Boston, and one of the things that you might know about the city is that we have a lot of sports fans. So we focused on the baseball fans, brought some to the lab, and we asked them to spend some time with us wearing some wristbands that we were interested in having them evaluate. Now, imagine being a core, really thoughtful fan for the Red Sox, and now all of a sudden you're wearing a wristband of the New York Yankees. People weren't happy, but more importantly, from our perspective, they felt inauthentic. And then we asked them to do a bunch of different things, one of which, a little bit cruel, we asked them to put their dominant hand in a bucket of ice. And we were interested in knowing how long they would be able to keep their hands in the bucket of ice, and we told them that they would be paid more the longer they kept their hand in the water. And what we found is that people were more resistant to the pain and persisted more when they felt authentic by wearing the wristband of their favorite team rather than inauthentic. So experiencing authenticity, in a sense, gave them that buffer to resist, again, the pain. Now, this is not just about persistence in this strange task. It's persistent more generally. In fact, we ran a lot of studies where we even look at how people are able to persist when they experience social pain, when they feel rejected by others. I'm going to show you one of the tasks that we use whenever we bring people to the lab. We ask them to do the following, to play a task on a computer with other people. And at first, the task goes like this, where you're playing this interesting ball moving around, and everybody's passing the ball to each other. But all of a sudden, the other two players you're playing with do something different. And in particular, they pass the ball to one another, and you're left out. This is actually a very powerful game where you're looking at it and saying, what the heck? What about me? And you feel rejected. And what we found is that both psychologically and physiologically, people experience much higher level of stress when they're feeling left out. But if they're injected with some authenticity, they're able to experience less pain. So authenticity then seems to be quite important at allowing us to create that type of emotional connection that brings us closer to our jobs as well as to our relationship at work. Now, let me move to the second idea, the idea of tension and conflict. What is interesting is that we can go back to a company like Pixar, and they embrace disagreement. In fact, they've done a lot of interesting activities around the fact of bringing tension and conflict out so as to improve what's going on with producing their movies as well as life at work. In fact, you might have heard about the really interesting initiative of having a notes day, where basically people go to work and they don't do what they're usually doing, but they spend time thinking through what's not going well in the organization, in their team, in their jobs. And then they write notes about just that. They share them with others, and then they figure out how to make the organization better. This is just one of the ways in which tension and conflict is created so as to make the decision-making process better, and in the end, the outcomes that the organization is interested in also better. Now, what is interesting is that that's very different from what we all enjoy. Think about conflict. That's usually the way we try to face it. We avoid it altogether. And having disagreements just makes us uncomfortable. We love people who look like us, and we rather move away from tension and conflict since we think that is not an important part of the process. And I would argue that rebels are fighting against this natural tendency of avoiding conflict, of avoiding tension, and instead they embrace it, the same way that you see Pixar animators and producers do. Now, one way in which we can embrace conflict is by bringing in multiple perspectives. I'd like you to think about a current decision you faced, whether at work or in your life. If I were to guess, the way you approached it is by asking the question, what should I do? And as it turns out, that's the wrong way of approaching the question, even if it comes natural to us. And it's the wrong way because it focuses our attention on our own view and is usually just one view. What we should be doing instead is embracing other perspectives. And for doing that, we need to ask the question a little bit differently. Rather than saying, what should I do? We should be asking, what could I do? Just that little shift allows us to bring multiple perspectives, create tension, create conflict, but in a way that can be productive and helpful to our own engagement. Now, I would like to stop thinking about conflict for a second. I'd like you to engage in a little exercise. We talked about the importance of reflection, so I'd like you to take a piece of paper and write down the answer to a few questions. I'm going to give you 4 dimensions, and for each of them, I would like you to think about who's in this room and rank yourself against them. Now, I don't want you to shout out your numbers. I like you to just write them down and think about why you're writing what you're writing, okay? So let's imagine that I'm giving you one dimension. If you think that on that particular dimension you're the best person in the room, you're going to write down 100%. If you think you're the worst person in the room, it's a 0. And if you think you're somewhere in between, you can choose a number between 0 and 100%. Only rule to keep in mind, since it's easy to forget, 100% is your maximum. So we're not going to go above that, okay? So again, write down the numbers. Do not share at your table. Just keep them for yourself. Your ability to make a decision is the first dimension I'd like you to rank yourself on. The second dimension is your ability to get along well with other people. The third dimension is your ability to negotiate effectively. These are all dimensions that are good for the work you do. And finally, why not your honesty? Okay, it's early in the morning, but if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to do some math. So look at the 4 numbers that you have on the piece of paper. And I would like you to compute the average. And again, you should be left with one number that is between 0 and 100%. If it's above 100, you're doing the math wrong. Or maybe you weren't paying attention to the rules. Okay. You've all done the math? Yeah? As I said, the numbers are yours, but if you don't mind, just out of curiosity, if the average number that you wrote down on the piece of paper is a number bigger than 50, 50, just raise your hand up high so I can see it. See, that's why I love the idea of spending time with you this morning. This is fantastic. That basically we got, I think, 99% of the room having numbers above 50, we just proved a mathematical impossibility in this very room. Now, we're doing this exercise not to make fun of each other, but to point to a natural tendency that we all have, which is to think very highly of ourselves. In fact, I could have picked whatever dimension and we would have seen the same results. To convince you, I want to bring some data into the picture and tell you about a survey that was conducted back in 1996 on 1,000 Americans. They were asked a slightly different question. And the question was, who's likely to get into heaven? And they were ranking a bunch of people, one of which was Bill Clinton. Didn't do so well at the time. I remember this is 1996. Another person was Michael Jordan, who did a little bit better. Mother Teresa, interestingly enough, got a 79% chance of getting into heaven. We have high standards. That's not a bad thing, I would say. But the reason why I'm mentioning this data to you is that there was another category of people who did even better than Mother Teresa, and that was the respondent themselves, with an 87% chance of getting into heaven. Now, this is interesting. I'm going to summarize it for you with a picture. This is what we do. This is our own natural tendency. And so when we are at work with others in meetings, we fall in love with our own perspective. We fall in love with our own view. And that makes it difficult for us to embrace conflict. What rebels do that it's different from what most people do, they embrace different perspective. They embrace diversity of opinions. They fight against this very natural tendency to go and stay narrowly focused on our own view, and also, if we open up, to go with people who are very much like us. Now, let me talk about the third idea, unpredictability. That is also something that animators, but also storytellers more generally, and directors at Pixar think about quite carefully. And in fact, it's a fun exercise to go through every single movie and film that Pixar produced and ask the directors for stories of how the story changed. And one of the things that you discover if you went through that exercise is that one of the things that they work very carefully on is to create surprises. to create challenges for the characters in such a way that the story is not flat. So you can take, for example, Toy Story 2. Now, in that case, the task was a little bit more difficult because you already had Toy Story, a very successful movie. And now you're thinking through the story to tell. And there is an interesting point in Toy Story 2 where you see the little cowboy, Woody, making an interesting choice. If you remember, if you watched the movie, at some point he gets lost. He found himself in the apartment of a collector, and he meets some new characters who are part of a collection. And initially, the story was such that the decision that Woody was facing was whether to go to Japan and end up in a museum or go home. But if you watch Toy Story, you know that it's really not a decision. Of course he's going to go home. There is a child who's waiting for him, Andy, and you know from the previous movie that Woody is his favorite toy. So the team had to go back and say, how do we create unpredictability, making sure that the audience is there with us, thinking that this is the choice that he's making, but another choice is also possible. And so they actually brought in new stories and new text from the other characters who were trying to convince him that maybe going to Japan and ending up in a museum is not a bad thing because children grow up and they leave their toys behind. And so being exposed out there for people to enjoy seeing you in a museum is much better than going back and ending up in a closet. So that's a way in which the story was revised such that there is such unpredictability. Now, what is interesting is that, again, if we bring this back to us as humans, we often love the familiar. We often love our routines. We love our traditions. We don't like the new. And yet, when we engage in new stuff, and when we are faced with challenges, that's where we really have an opportunity to stay engaged. There is some fantastic research actually looking at this very issue in the context of romantic couples. So some of the studies bring couples in that have been together for about a year and a half, and so things are getting more like routine. And then they have them engage in all sorts of fun activities that present some challenges and that they're new. And what these studies found is that when the couples go through these challenges, their relationship gets stronger. Now, I'm not telling you this to save your marriages if you're a little bit in trouble, but what I'm telling you is that we all have this thirst for the new, even if our human nature brings us back to the familiar. So there are ways to bring the new and the challenges also into organizations. I'm going to give you a couple of ideas of how that can be done a little bit more thoughtfully. First, let me go back to Bottura. This is, again, a top restaurant, 3 Michelin stars. So you might imagine that things are, in a sense, scripted in the way dishes are prepared, they get out, such that the standard is always 100%. And yet, what Bottura does to keep his people on their toes, is sometimes to have last-minute challenges. So for instance, as I saw while I was there visiting, you might come up with a new item to add to the menu that they've been experimenting with at the last minute, as they're actually doing service. And again, that makes the sous chefs and everybody else in the kitchen a little bit anxious, and yet it keeps them engaged in the job that they do. This is not just about top restaurant. In fact, in a sense, you could go to the other end of the spectrum, as I did. I traveled all the way to Tennessee. And what I met is this, which was interesting. I never had fast food before, and this was a great way to try just that. But this business actually caught my attention for another reason. They're called Pulse Sudden Service, and they really care about the fast part. So their services is fast. And if you look at all possible numbers that you can gather, they're quite impressive. They're much better than the average in terms of their customer satisfactions, in terms of their inspection scores, but also in terms of the mistakes that they make. In their case, is 1 in every 3,600, when the industry average is 1 in 15. So I went in there looking at what they were doing. And what you see when you're inside that little box, it's a very constrained space where everybody's working almost mechanically. If you know the industry, you might know that usually the training that you get on every station is about 2 hours. For example, at McDonald's. At Pulse Sudden Service, you're trained for 135 hours on every station. Why? Because they care about precision, they care about speed, they care about zero defect. So you can probably get a sense of the climate in there. Everybody's working super fast, especially when there are lots of people at the window, at lunch hour, or at dinner time. And you might think that the work is also very repetitive. And yet, even in a case like that, where you may expect people to get into a routine and almost become bored with the repetitive work that they do, the Pulse leadership is thinking very carefully about engagement. So in their case, they have challenges. Every store is owned by a general manager. They call them owner-operators. And what is interesting is that they have weekly challenges. So while I was there, I learned, for instance, that an employee was asked to engage in a challenge where she would have to remember 100 orders in 1 hour. And you might say, how is that possible? And in fact, I thought it was impossible, and so she did. But then, since some of the customers are repeat customers, and you get to learn their faces, and you get to learn their habits in terms of what they're ordering, she was actually able to win the challenge. Or another way in which Pulse does what they do is that they think carefully about new and variety and novelty. How? Every day at work, you know that you're working on different stations and you're moving around, but you don't know the order. Every time you arrive at work, you're told in which order you'll be working on the different stations. Whether it's grilling hamburger or preparing shakes, is something that you learn when you get to work in the morning. Now, that might be subtle, and yet is a way, even in a job that might look repetitive, to keep engagement high because you're working on novelty. Now, that's what fighting the predictable, the familiar, the routine does to us, is keeping us engaged because we're seeking the novel, and that's exciting. The same way it is to engage in a new activity with your spouse in the couple study that I told you about. Unpredictability also does something else for us. Again, if you go back to storytelling, unpredictability creates surprises, and that keeps us curious. It keeps us on our feet because we're asking the question, what if, or what might happen next? Now, what is interesting when I think about why I ended up studying rebels is that, as I told you, I often spend time in organizations, and I saw an interesting puzzle. This is the type of conversation I would have with people in all sorts of jobs, in all sorts of industries, from entertainment, healthcare, pharma, manufacturing, you name it. I would go in, and in their first week on the job, there was excitement. Lots of smiles. People are ready to contribute. They're ready to start. You talk to them about 9 to 12 months later, they're not smiling anymore. And the conversations go like, what's going on? I'm frustrated. I'm waiting for the end of the day. The passion, the excitement isn't there. And that to me is puzzling. We spend most of our lives at work. Why is it that work sucks? It makes no sense. It should be engaging. It should keep our attention. So what I'm hoping for you to think about is how these ideas can be brought back to work. One of the dimensions where we see the drop in the data is on people's level of curiosity. Now, all of us are born with a certain level of curiosity. If you have children, you know exactly what I mean. My days usually start at 6:15 with my 1.5-year-old daughter running around in the kitchen, and she opens up a closet, and the colander is out, and now the colander is in her head, and now she's using it as a mask, and now she's using it as a shoe. And the urge that I have as she is opening up little closet in the kitchens, while I need to make my coffee, is to stop her, to pick her up and stop the mess. And that is interesting, because I think organizations do the same thing to us by shutting down our curiosity, by shutting down our desire to explore, because there is a worry that there's going to be a mess, that there is going to be failure, that there are going to be mistakes, and that by being curious, they're not going to spend time doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is execute on the work. And as it turns out, if we're actually able to instill curiosity in people by fostering a sense in them that they need to keep asking questions, the benefits are quite remarkable. They're more engaged, they perform better in their job, they actually develop larger networks, thus getting the support that they need in their own development and career. So for all of you, think about how these three ideas could be applied to your own organizations. How is it that, like the rebels, you can fight this instinct of not wanting to make yourself uncomfortable, putting yourself out there like the coach Cheeks did, and create that strong emotional connection with others at work and with work itself. Think about how you can fight against the instinct of falling in love with our own view and perspective and instead broaden things up and really using opportunities to leverage differences, capitalize on them, and listen to others' perspective. And then think about how you can fight that instinct of going with the familiar, with our routine, with focusing on just executing the work, rather than going for the novel, the unfamiliar, and allowing for our curiosity to shine. So if I go back to the question that I asked you at the beginning, who are the rebels? Hopefully now the words that are coming to mind are a little bit different. They're not the annoying people, they're not the troublemakers. They're people that, yes, go against expectations. Yes, there are people who break the rules, but they achieve all sorts of benefits. In the end, and at their core, the rebels stay engaged in the long term. And it's quite striking that we don't see more of them at work. The rebels are people who are authentic, and they're not afraid of being who they are at work. They are people who engage multiple perspectives when they look at problems, rather than just staying in the should mindset of looking at their own perspective. They embrace diversity by leveraging differences. They don't treat diversity as a problem. They treat it as an opportunity to make ourselves and others better. They're also people who seek the novel and unfamiliar, and in the end, they're able to remain curious. What I hope you're taking away is that doing all of this is not that difficult. I gave you some example of organizations that started small. Think about Wipro. Just a half an hour of reflection changed the way people approach their work, their relationships, and stayed with the organizations for longer. Think about Bottura, think about Pulse Sudden Services, think about Ariel Investment with Melody Hobson. They all found ways in which they can fight human nature in small ways and make sure that they allowed others to embrace all of this. In fact, one of the things that I saw in Melody Hobson that was quite striking as I was observing her way of operating with others, she is one person that not only thinks very carefully about authenticity, she also thinks carefully about this idea of embracing conflicts and having multiple perspectives. So you might be in a meeting with her, and the discussion is going well, and all of a sudden she stands up and says, "It's time to make the donuts." And what she means, it's a reference to an ad by Dunkin' Donuts, where you would see Fred the baker. You might have seen the ad in the past. He wakes up in the morning, he goes to work, he makes donuts. And then next, it's at night, goes to bed, wakes up in the morning, makes donut again. The next day, wakes up, makes donuts again. He gets into his routine. And what she's trying to do by saying what she says is, in a sense, wake people up. Tell them that what is happening at the table is exactly that people are falling into the error of agreeing with one another and just going with the flow. So what are the ways, in small ways, that we can follow her lead and make sure that we allow others to embrace all of these talents? So I'm going to stop here and make sure that you have the chance to ask questions. And hopefully, your heads are hurting a little bit, but for good reasons, with some ideas that you can take back. Thank you.